The suits fit, the smiles dazzled, and the headlines told love stories the public wanted to believe. But there was always another truth, stitched beneath the tuxedos and veiled behind studio contracts. Some wanted love, others needed protection, but they all lived behind a mask. These are the gay actors who married women, and the stories behind the roles they couldn't stop playing. First up is a man whose voice filled stadiums, even as his silence filled the spaces in between. In 1984, Elton John married Renate Blauwel in Sydney, with news headlines spinning the perfect story. But behind closed doors, he was unraveling. Elton had already come out as bisexual, but pressure to conform, to present something acceptable, pushed him further into silence. The marriage lasted 4 years. He later called it a mistake, admitting he was living a lie. When he came out publicly in 1992, it wasn't a revelation, it was a release. Renate would later sue him for discussing their past. Today, Elton is married to David Furnish, and they have 2 sons. For Rock Hudson, there was no coming out. There was only the end. Rock Hudson married Phyllis Gates in 1955, a marriage that lasted 3 years. She said she never knew, but biographers weren't so sure. Nevertheless, it didn't matter. The version of him the world adored wasn't the whole story. He was the leading man America wanted, while secretly becoming the man Hollywood feared. In 1985, his death forced a reckoning. His name was everywhere, but not his voice. He had died the way he lived, controlled by a system that profited from his image but silenced his truth. He didn't start the conversation, but he forced one. Not every story ended in silence. Before the activism, before the Broadway spotlight, and even before Grant Shaffer, there was Hillary Lyon. Alan Cumming married her in 1985, young, ambitious, and unsure of where his truth fit into his life. The marriage lasted nearly a decade. He later said he hadn't figured himself out yet, not fully. For him, it wasn't deception, it was confusion. The world expected him to be someone, and for a while, he tried. When he came out as bisexual in the late 90s, Cumming became one of the few openly bi actors in Hollywood. His openness helped challenge stereotypes, paving the way for more honest conversations about sexuality in the entertainment industry. For some, like Tony Richardson, revelation came only when it could no longer be avoided or denied. He won an Oscar. Then he married Vanessa Redgrave. The world saw Britain's new golden couple. Brilliant, artistic, unshakably elegant. But Tony Richardson was carrying a truth he couldn't speak. He had affairs with men throughout the marriage, a fact Redgrave later acknowledged. They divorced in 1967. For decades, Richardson avoided labels. Then, in 1991, he quietly came out, just before his death the same year. The industry paid tribute, but few talked about what he'd held back. He lived in a time when visibility came with a cost, and for Richardson, the risk felt too high to take. Elsewhere in the spotlight, another man's dual existence was carefully choreographed. To the public, he was the charming Australian showman who married Liza Minnelli, but in private, Peter Allen was drawn elsewhere. Their 1967 marriage made headlines, Broadway royalty tied in tradition. It ended quietly in 1974. Allen never made a formal announcement, but those around him already knew where his heart belonged. His songs hinted at loneliness, distance, and coded truths. In 1992, AIDS claimed him at age 48. He left behind music, memories, and a space the world hadn't fully made room for yet. Liza would later call their marriage real but complex. For Peter, honesty was gradual, carved through loss, love, and the stage he never left behind. Like Alan Anthony Perkins navigated love, secrecy, and legacy in a time that offered little room for honesty. He married Barry Berenson in 1973, and they stayed together until his death. But long before the wedding, Anthony Perkins was navigating a double life. Behind Psycho and the quiet charisma was a man trapped by a studio system that controlled not just roles, but reality. Perkins had relationships with men for years, but kept them hidden. In 1992, he died of AIDS-related complications. 2 months before his death, he broke the silence, but only briefly. It was his only public hint at the truth. Whatever he felt privately never made it into the press while he lived. Unlike those shaped by rigid studios or social conventions, Jason Mraz found himself adrift in ambiguity. His story doesn't begin with marriage, it begins with uncertainty, both public and personal. In 2015, he revealed he had been married to Sheridan Edley in the early 2000s, something most fans never knew. The marriage was brief, and Mraz would later describe himself as having two spirit energies. His sexuality puzzled interviewers, stirred headlines, and at times left even him uncertain. In 2018, he publicly came out as bisexual after years of reflection. He's since embraced that identity openly, but the early years were clouded by pressure to simplify who he was. Mraz never hid out of fear. He hesitated because even he didn't yet have the words for what he felt. For some actors, concealment wasn't a choice. It was built into the contract. Richard Cromwell was a 1930s heartthrob best known for his marriage to Angela Lansbury. They wed in 1945. It lasted less than a year. Lansbury was 19. Cromwell was 35. Decades later, biographers revealed what the public never knew. Cromwell was gay. Lansbury said she had no idea at the time. Back then, marriage wasn't just tradition, it was armor. Cromwell never publicly addressed his sexuality before his death in 1960. His career faded early, and his private life remained just that. The truth only surfaced when it no longer risked anything. Only few close to him truly understood the quiet life he led away from cameras, while others stayed silent until their final moments. Jonathan Plummer thrust into the spotlight mid-confession, his life unfolding under a different kind of scrutiny. Jonathan didn't step into fame, he was pulled into it. Best known as the ex-husband of author Terry McMillan, Plummer married her in 1998. He was more than 20 years younger, and the relationship inspired her hit novel, How Stella Got Her Groove Back. In 2004, Plummer came out as gay. The news stunned fans, but for Plummer, it marked the start of something real. The divorce went public, and the story became a national talking point. McMillan later said she forgave him. Plummer said he had to stop pretending. The marriage ended, but his coming out gave him something the relationship never could. Also among those who kept up appearances for decades was Philip Schofield. His revelation didn't come with a red carpet or magazine exclusive. It came through a live TV confession. For years, he was the polished face of British daytime television, married to Stephanie Lowe since 1993, father of 2 daughters. Then, in 2020, after over 2 decades of marriage, he came out as gay. The announcement wasn't explosive. It was quiet, emotional, and heavy. Schofield said it took him years to face the truth, that he had been coming to terms with it slowly and painfully. His wife stood by him as he transitioned into honesty, but the relationship, as it was, ended with the truth. Before the world watched these stories unfold in real time, Mark Herron lived his in the shadows. In 1965, he married Judy Garland. Yes, that Judy Garland. The marriage lasted months. Herron was gay, and Garland reportedly knew. Theirs wasn't a simple love story. It was tangled, stormy, and endlessly misread by the public. Herron was later in a long-term relationship with actor Henry Brandon. But during Garland's final years, his name was tethered to hers in a way that obscured everything else. He never made a statement, never defined himself. For Herron, the performance never stopped, even when the audience had long since moved on. Later on, Herron was in a long-term relationship with Henry Brandon until his death in 1996. And then there's Little Richard, whose life was a contradiction wrapped in spectacle. In 1959, he married Ernestine Campbell, a quiet office worker who didn't match the flash he brought to the stage. They divorced a few years later, and little Richard would go on to speak openly and sometimes conflictingly about his sexuality. He said he was gay. Then he called it unnatural. Then he took it back again. The pressure to be someone else pulled him in every direction. His interviews became confessionals, his music a kind of coded release. If his marriage confused the public, it mirrored the turmoil inside him. He never stopped wrestling with who he was. They played the part the world expected, but some truths don't stay hidden forever. If love had been allowed to speak freely, how many of these stories do you think would have ended differently?